Hey, my name is Caleb. I'm 33 years old, and I live in a small rented house at the end of Claiborne Road in Garrett, Indiana, a town of about 9,000 people in the flat northeastern corner of the state, where the grain elevator is the tallest thing you can see from any direction, and the roads run straight, because there was never any reason to curve them. I moved here 8 years ago, for a reason that made sense at the time, and stayed for reasons I would be hard-pressed to fully explain, which is the way most of the best decisions in my life have worked. I restore pianos. That is the short version. The longer version is that I take in instruments that have been neglected, damaged, flooded, overheated, or simply closed and forgotten in rooms where no one played them for 20 or 30 years, and I bring them back to what they were supposed to be. I have a workshop in my garage, 3 workbenches, a humidity system, more tools than anyone would expect for a profession that is essentially furniture repair with a musical component, and at any given time between 1 and 4 pianos in various stages of coming apart or coming back together. I drive out to clients for tuning and minor repairs. I take the larger restorations into the shop. It is quiet, careful work that requires a specific kind of patience, which is not the patience of waiting, but the patience of listening, of understanding that the thing you are working on will tell you what it needs if you stop trying to force it and start paying attention to what it is actually doing. I have been doing this since I was 22, when I apprenticed under a man named Victor Hess, who was then 68, and who believed, with the quiet ferocity of someone who has been right about something for a long time, that a piano is not a machine, but a record of every room it has ever lived in. Victor died 4 years ago. I still think about something he said to me in my second year, when I was frustrated with Obsendorfer that refused to stay in tune. You're listening for what you want it to be. Stop. Listen to what it is. Then you'll hear what it's missing. I have tried to apply this advice to more things than pianos. My days in Garrett look roughly the same from the outside. I wake up around 6 and make coffee and drink it in the workshop while the heat comes up. I work until noon or so, then drive out to any appointments I have, then come back in the afternoon for the heavier restoration work, which requires light and quiet and the particular quality of attention that is difficult to sustain after 7 in the evening. I eat something around 7, usually simple. I read. I go to sleep early enough that most people my age would find it strange. I'm not going to tell you this was a lonely life. It was not. Victor used to say that a man who can be alone with his work is a wealthy man, and I believe that, and still believe it. But I will say that there were evenings when I would close the workshop and walk through the dark house to the kitchen and make dinner and eat it at the table without a sound except the refrigerator and the road, and I would think, this is the same as yesterday, the same as the one before. And the thought was not terrible, it was just flat, in the way a string sounds flat when it's been sitting under the wrong tension for too long. Not broken, not silent, just not quite right. Her name had been Diane. We were together 3 years, engaged for the last 6 months of it. She was from Indianapolis originally, and she was cheerful and practical, and she laughed in a way that made a room feel larger. She wanted a life that moved, not a bad life, not a wrong life, just a life that was going somewhere geographically and professionally, and in the way that cities feel like they are going somewhere even when they are standing still. I wanted Garrett and the work, and the slow accumulation of knowing a place well. She was not wrong about what she needed. I was not wrong about what I needed. The problem was the overlap had narrowed to almost nothing, and we had both been too careful with each other to say so, until finally she said it, and I said I knew, and she left, and I stayed, and we were both correct. She left me a box of things I'd lent her over the years. The old brown leather jacket was in it. She'd had it so long, I had almost stopped thinking of it as mine. I hung it on the hook by the door and did not think much about it after that. That was 4 years ago. 3 weeks before the night she stood on my porch, I had lent the jacket out again. It was early November, a bonfire at Joel Mercer's property on the county road. Joel had been my neighbor, and then my acquaintance, and then my friend over the course of the 8 years I'd been in Garrett, in the way friendships accumulate in small towns. Slowly, and without any single moment you can point to. There were maybe 20 people. It got cold faster than anyone had prepared for. I was standing near the fire when Joel's friend from across town said he'd be right back and jogged to his car, and the woman he'd come with was left standing at the edge of the firelight looking cold in a way that was becoming an actual problem. Joel said, "Caleb, you mind?" I took off the jacket and handed it over without much thought. She said thank you. She said it fit. I said it was old. She was welcome to keep it until she didn't need it. We exchanged maybe 40 words over the course of the whole evening, and I left early because I had a restoration I wanted to get back to, and that was all of it. I did not particularly expect to see her again. Joel said he'd get the jacket back to me at some point. I said there was no hurry. 3 weeks later, on a Thursday evening in late November, I was in my kitchen around 7 when I heard a knock at the door. She was standing on my porch holding the jacket folded over both arms, like something being formally returned. Her hair was down, and the cold had put color in her face. She was wearing a green coat that was not quite warm enough for the night, and old boots that had some miles on them, and she had the slightly braced expression of someone who has rehearsed a short conversation and would like to get through it efficiently. "Hi," she said. "I'm Nora. We met at Joel's bonfire. I have your jacket." "I remember," I said. "You didn't have to come all the way out here. Joel could have." "I know," she said. "I had it in my car for 2 weeks, and I kept not giving it to him, and tonight I drove past the turn and I thought, I should just do this. I only came to return your jacket." She held it out. "So, here it is." I took it. I thanked her. She said it was a good jacket, very warm. I said yes, it was old, but it held up. We were at the part of the exchange where she would say good night and go back to her car. I had my hand on the door. From inside the house, faint but clear, came the sound of a piano. She paused. Not a dramatic pause, just the slight delay of someone whose attention has been caught by something they weren't expecting. "Is that?" she said. "It's a recording," I said, which was not true. It was a recording of the piece I was trying to learn how to coax out of the 1942 Steinway upright in my workshop, playing through the small Bluetooth speaker I use to remember where I'm going while I work. I have no idea why I said it was a recording. She looked at the door. Then she looked at me with the direct honesty of someone who is not going to pretend she didn't hear what she heard. "Can I come in for a minute?" I almost said, "It's just the work. It's not ready to play. There's nothing to hear." I had the sentence fully formed. I said, "Sure." She stayed 2 hours that first night. I showed her the workshop, the Steinway upright in pieces, the action assembly laid out across the long workbench with its 88 hammers and shanks arranged in order, each one labeled. She stood in the doorway and looked at it the way people look at something that surprises them with its scale. She asked questions that were not the questions people usually ask. Not how long does it take or is it expensive, but what do you listen for? And how do you know when it's right? And what happens to a piano when nobody plays it for a long time? I told her, The strings go slack and then sharp as the tension changes. The soundboard dries or warps. The felt hardens. The action gets stiff and imprecise. The piano doesn't forget what it's supposed to be. It just gets buried under everything that's happened to it since. The restoration is not adding something new. It is removing everything that got in the way of what was already there. She thought about this for a moment. Then she said, "I teach kindergarten. 5-year-olds. It's not the same thing at all. But there's something about that. Removing what's in the way of what's already there. That sounds familiar." I said that was a more perceptive comparison than most people made. She said she'd been told she was perceptive. She said it lightly, not as a boast, as something she'd been told so often it had become a fact she was used to carrying. We went inside, and I made coffee, and she sat at the kitchen table, and we talked. And I cannot give you the whole of it the way it actually was. I can only say that it was the kind of conversation I had not had in a long time. One where I was not explaining myself to someone who was waiting patiently to understand me, but talking to someone who was already somewhere close to understanding and just needed the specific words. It is a rare thing. I noticed it the way you notice when a string comes into tune. A change in quality so distinct you can feel it in your hands before you can quite name it. She left at 9. She said goodnight from the door. I said goodnight. She drove out of the driveway, and the red of her taillights disappeared down Claiborne Road. I stood at the kitchen window for a moment, and then went back to the workshop. She came back 3 days later. No stated reason. She'd been driving past after school, she said, and thought she'd stop. She had 2 coffees from the gas station up the road. She had guessed his order wrong. He drank black. She had brought cream and sugar for both. He told her. She said she'd know for next time. Next time was a Tuesday. Then a Thursday. By the second week of December, she was coming by 4 afternoons out of 5, and neither of us named this or made any comment on its frequency. She would sit on the old chair in the workshop doorway and grade papers or read while I worked. And we would talk or not talk depending on how the work was going and what the afternoon felt like. There was a specific quality to the silence between us in those hours that I found I was relying on in a way that made me careful. I am a man who has learned, through one particular and precise lesson, to be careful with the things he relies on. She surprised me mid-December with something I had not seen coming. A client called about a Mason and Hamlin Grand that was losing pitch too quickly between tunings, a classic symptom of a cracked soundboard, but it could also be environmental. And I was on the phone for 10 minutes trying to walk the client through the diagnostic questions while simultaneously thinking through the sequence of what I'd need to examine. Nora was at the workbench behind me with a stack of papers. Halfway through the call, she got up, found the relevant page in my restoration reference manual, and put it open in front of me on the workbench with the correct section already marked. I finished the call. I looked at the page. I looked at her. She said, "I've been watching you work for 3 weeks, and I teach 5-year-olds. Anticipating what someone needs before they know they need it is the whole job." I said, "You found the right section." She said, "It wasn't that hard. You had the book flagged there already." I said, "Still." She looked at me with a slight lift at the corner of her mouth and went back to her papers. I stood at the workbench for a long moment after that, not working. Just being aware of what it felt like to be in a room with someone and not be alone in any of the ways that matter. A few days later, I had to move the Steinway's body off the rolling platform and onto a stationary base, a job that technically requires 2 people, but that I had been managing alone for years with a combination of moving blankets, patience, and an unhealthy confidence in my own back. She appeared in the doorway of the workshop as I was setting up the blankets, looked at what I was doing, and said, "You need help." I said I was fine. She said, "You are demonstrating that you are about to wreck your shoulder." She came in and took the far end, and we moved it together, not without argument, because the angle through the interior door frame was tighter than it looked, and I had a specific sequence for it that I had worked out over several careful failures. And she had a different read on the geometry that turned out to be correct, which I admitted in approximately the tone of a man who has admitted something like this before and is mostly over the indignity of it. We set the piano down. We stood back and looked at it. She said, "Your sequence would have worked too, just slower." I said that was generous of her. She said she was a generous person. She stayed for dinner that night. I made something simple, pasta, a sauce from whatever was in the cabinet, and she sat at the kitchen table, and we ate without ceremony. And at some point during the meal, I noticed that we had stopped talking about the piano and the children in her class and all the other subjects that had become familiar between us. And we were just sitting in the kitchen in the evening in the way two people sit together when the subjects are no longer the point. It was the first time that it happened. I recognized it for what it was, and I did not say anything about it, which was the right decision. But I thought about it for a long time after she left. In the week before Christmas, I finished the action assembly on the Steinway upright and was ready to test the full keyboard for the first time. It was late on a Friday, cold in the workshop despite the heat running, and Nora was in the doorway as usual, with her knees drawn up and a mug of tea between her hands. I played a scale, then a chord, then another chord. She said nothing. I adjusted a string and played again. Listened, adjusted, played, she said, from the doorway, that second chord. That's the one. I had not told her what I was listening for. I played the chord again. She said, "The first one was close. The second one is right." I sat at the bench for a moment. Then I said, "How did you know?" She said, "I've been listening to you work for a month. You make a specific sound when something is close and a different sound when it's right. When it's right, you stop." She looked at her tea. "You stopped." I closed the keyboard lid. The workshop was very quiet, just the hum of the humidity system and the small sounds of a house settling in the cold. I said, "Can I ask you something?" She said yes. "Why do you keep coming back?" She was quiet for a long moment. Outside, through the narrow workshop window, I could see the dark yard and the beginning of something. Sleet, maybe, or the first thin snow. She looked at it. She said, "I was engaged 2.5 years ago. He was a good man, everyone liked him, and I liked him, and I kept thinking I would feel what I was supposed to feel, and I kept not feeling it, or feeling it sometimes, and then not. And I couldn't name what was wrong. By the time I could name it, we were 6 months out from the wedding, and the venue was booked. I called it off." She paused. "Everyone thought I was making a mistake. I thought I might be making a mistake. I drove to Garrett 2 weeks later for a job I'd applied for months earlier, and I didn't go back. I said, 'Do you regret it?' She said, 'I regret that I hurt him. I don't regret what I knew.' I thought about that. I said, 'I was engaged once. She left because I wouldn't go, and she was right to. I knew the whole time she was right. I just couldn't make myself move.' Pause. That's a different kind of knowing. She said, 'What did you do with it?' I said, 'Stayed here. Worked. Learned to be careful with things.' She looked at me for a long moment. I could not entirely read it, which was unusual. I had been learning to read her for a month, and I was mostly accurate. But this look was something I did not have words for yet. She held it for a few more seconds, and then turned back to the window. She said, 'I came back because this is the first place since I moved to Garrett where I haven't been careful.' She said it plainly, like a fact she had worked out privately, and was now simply reporting. There was a small gesture then. She reached over and put 2 fingers briefly on the back of my hand where it rested on the bench. Not quite a touch, just a contact. The way you press a key softly to hear what it will do. Then she took her hand back and looked at the window again. I did not say anything. I understood the gesture, and I understood why she had not named it, and I did not name it either. Because the correct response to something spoken in that register is not a declaration. It is staying in the room. It is not turning away or explaining or rushing toward the feeling before it has finished arriving. Victor had said something once about the worst thing you can do to a piano in the early stages of restoration, which is to tune it too quickly, before the wood has had time to relax into the new tension. He said the strings would hold for a day and then slip back, and you'd have to start over. You had to give it time. You had to let the thing settle. After a while, she finished her tea and said it was getting late, and I walked her to her car, and she drove away, and I stood on the cold driveway until her taillights disappeared. The yard was dark, and the fields beyond it were dark, and the sky had the particular heavy gray of a sky considering snow. I had been listening carefully for 6 weeks. I knew what I was hearing. I just had not yet decided what to do with knowing it. On a Thursday afternoon in early January, I was in the workshop when Nora came in with 2 coffees, the right order this time, black for me, cream for her, and sat down and said, before I could say anything, Preston was at the school yesterday. I set down the tool I was holding. Preston was the man she had been engaged to. She had not said his name before. I had not asked. I waited. She said, he drove from Columbus. He wants to meet. He says he's had time to think and he doesn't understand why I ended it, and he wants to talk about it. She looked at the floor. He says I made a decision and I need to explain it to him. I said, what do you want to do? She said, I don't want to go backwards. I said, then don't. She looked up. It's not that simple. He's not wrong that I owe him an explanation. I said, you can give him the explanation without going backwards. She nodded slowly. She looked like she was deciding something. Then she picked up her coffee and changed the subject to a child in her class who had asked, in full seriousness, whether fish had opinions, and we moved on from Preston, and I thought that was the end of it. It was not the end of it. 2 days later, on a Saturday afternoon when Nora wasn't there, I heard a car on the gravel drive. I went to the door. A man I had not met but had formed a picture of was standing outside, hands in his jacket pockets, looking at the house with the calm of someone who has driven a long way and is willing to take the time he needs. He introduced himself. He was polite, genuinely polite, not the performed kind. He said he wasn't there to cause trouble. He just wanted to understand. He'd heard through mutual people in town that Nora had been spending time at my house, and he was trying to understand the full picture. I said I was sorry he'd driven so far, but I wasn't sure what I could tell him. He said, she doesn't know what she wants. I spent 3 years with her. She makes these decisions, big, permanent decisions, and then she can't explain them. I'm not saying she's wrong to do what she did. I'm saying she doesn't know what she's actually doing. She never has. I looked at him. He said this as a fact, with the patience of a man explaining something simple. I said, I've known her for 2 months. He said, right. I said, in 2 months she has told me exactly what she wants, exactly what she won't accept, and exactly who she is. Clearly and without confusion. I paused. She knows what she wants. She knew when she left you. The part that might be uncomfortable is that what she wanted wasn't you, and that's not the same thing as not knowing. He was quiet. I said, I think you should go. He went, not angrily. That was not who he was. He went the way a reasonable man goes when he has been told something he does not want to accept and is choosing for now not to fight it. I watched his car back out of the drive. I stood at the door until the sound of the gravel was gone. Then I went back inside and stood in the kitchen for a while. I want to be honest about what I felt, which is that I did not feel triumphant or certain or any of the clean emotions a person might expect from that kind of exchange. What I felt was something quieter and less comfortable. I had told a man I'd never met that the woman he had spent 3 years with knew her own mind. I believed that when I said it. I had been watching her know her own mind for 2 months, and I believed it with the certainty I bring to things I have listened to carefully. But there is a difference between knowing something is true and knowing what to do with the truth. I had said what I believed. Now I had to figure out what saying it meant. That evening I called Nora and told her what had happened. She was quiet on the phone for a long moment. Then she said, "What did you say? Exactly?" I told her exactly. She said, after another pause, "You meant that?" I said, "Yes." She said, "I'll see you tomorrow." She came the next afternoon. I was inside, not in the workshop, just in the house, because it was a Sunday and the Steinway was finished, and I had given myself the day. She came in and took off her coat and started making dinner in my kitchen, which had been happening gradually and without announcement for several weeks. She knew where things were. She knew I had no fresh herbs and planned around this without comment. We ate at the kitchen table. The Steinway was in the front room now. I'd moved it out of the workshop the week before, which is what I do when a restoration is complete. It stood near the window with its lid down, solid and quiet. The way pianos are quiet when they are waiting. After dinner we stayed at the table with the plates pushed aside, coffee going cold between us. The house was easy and warm in the way it had become since she had started filling it. Outside the window it had started snowing, thin and early and December quiet, the first real snow of the season landing without announcement. She said, "I only came to return your jacket." I said, "I know." She said, "That was 8 weeks ago." I know. She looked at the snow. "I keep not leaving." I said, "I noticed." She said, "I don't know when that stopped being something I was doing accidentally." I said, "I do. It was the piano. You asked if you could hear it. I almost told you it wasn't ready, that there was nothing to listen to yet. I almost closed the door and said good night. I stopped. I'm glad I didn't." She looked at me. She said, "I was so careful when I came here. After what happened with Preston, after everyone telling me I didn't know my own mind, I thought maybe they were right. I thought maybe I would keep arriving at things and not knowing if I wanted them or only thought I wanted them. I didn't trust what I felt about anything." She paused. I was afraid to trust it here. I kept waiting to feel the doubt. For months I kept waiting for it to arrive and tell me I was doing it again, mistaking something familiar for something real. I said, "Did it arrive?" She said, "No." She looked at the snow in the window. That's what scared me. I said, "You know what happens to a piano that's been sitting in a cold room for 20 years? She waited. When you first open it, it doesn't sound right. It can't. It's been under the wrong tension for too long, and the wood has done what wood does in cold and silence. You have to bring it back slowly, string by string. You can't rush that part, or you lose what you've done. And the whole time you're listening. Not for what you want it to be, for what it is, for what's underneath all the damage and the cold and the time." I stopped. You can always hear it. If you listen the right way, you can hear what something is supposed to sound like even before the work is finished, even before it's ready. I looked at her. I have been listening to you since the night you stood on my porch. I knew what I was hearing. I was just trying not to tune it too quickly. She was very still. She said, "Is that what you were doing? Listening?" I said, "Yes." She came around the table. She put her arms around me from behind and rested her chin on my shoulder, and I put my hand over hers on the table, and neither of us said anything for a long time. Outside, the snow came down in the dark. When she finally spoke, she said it quietly, the way you say the things that are most true, not for the room, just for the person next to you. She said, "I knew it was going to sound like this." I said, "Like what?" She said, "Right." The following November, the jacket is on the hook by the front door. Not because anyone returned it, because it lives there now. She wears it on cold mornings when she goes out to get the mail and doesn't want to bother with her own coat, just reaches for the nearest thing. I have found her in it in the kitchen and on the porch, and once, early on a Saturday, asleep on the couch with it pulled over her like a blanket, and not once have I asked for it back. The thought does not occur to me. It is simply where the jacket is. The Steinway upright is in the front room, near the window. She plays it sometimes, though she will tell you she can't play. She had 6 years of lessons as a child and has lost most of what she knew. And what she plays is slow and uncertain and beautiful, in the way that uncertain things are beautiful when the person doing them is paying real attention. I have sat and listened and said nothing. The way she sat in the workshop doorway and listened and said nothing for months while I worked. I understand now what she was giving me during those afternoons. Company that asks nothing of you is the rarest thing there is. I did not know how long I had been going without it until it was there. Joel came by in the spring. He stood in the kitchen drinking coffee and looked through the doorway at the Steinway, and then at Nora coming in from the yard with her coat on and a book under her arm. And he said, to no one in particular, "I thought that was going to go on forever." I said, "What was?" He said, "You being alone in this house." He looked at me. "I'm glad it didn't." He said it the way you say something you've been waiting to say, plain, and with a slight emphasis that was not sentiment but precision. She still teaches the kindergartners. She comes home in the late afternoon smelling of watercolor and apple juice, and talking about the children the way you talk about people who live inside your heart. Their small triumphs and their specific fears and the things they say at snack time that are accidentally the most accurate observations she's heard all week. The one who asked whether fish have opinions has since asked whether clouds get tired, whether numbers know how big they are, and whether people who lived a long time ago knew they would be history. She brings these home and puts them on the kitchen table between us like small bright things she found on the way, and I have come to understand that this is one of the things she is. A person who notices what is surprising and brings it to you. I have taken on more restoration work this year. There is more space in me for it, not less of other things, just more capacity. The way a room feels larger when it is well used instead of carefully empty. Victor used to say the best piano technician he ever knew was a man who had been deeply loved, because love teaches you to hear what's there instead of what you expect. I did not understand that when he said it. I understand it now. I think about the jacket sometimes. A brown leather jacket, soft at the elbows. A zipper I finally replaced in February because it had needed it for years and there was no longer any reason to put it off. She brought it over one Thursday evening and stood on my porch and said she only came to return it. She never left. I have turned this over in my mind many times, trying to find the moment where it could have gone differently. The moment I almost said it's just a recording. The moment I almost said come back when it's ready to play. The moment I nearly let the sensible thing win out over the true thing. Those moments were all there. I can see them clearly in hindsight. Every place the evening could have closed. Every version of that night that ended with her driving down Claiborne Road with no reason to return. I opened the door instead. I said, "Sure, come in." Maybe that is the whole of it. Not a plan, not readiness. Which I have learned is mostly a story we tell ourselves after the fact. Just a Thursday evening, and a woman standing on a porch with a jacket over her arms and an exit already announced. And a man who had spent enough years being careful about the wrong things that he finally recognized, in the specific quality of that particular moment, what it would cost him to be careful again. She said she only came to return the jacket. I keep it on the hook by the door, and I have stopped thinking of it as mine. The jacket is where she put it, and so is she, and those two facts are now the same fact, which is that this house has not been quiet in a long time. Not in the way it was quiet before, the flat, careful quiet of a place where only one person lives. Now it is full of the sounds of her, which are the sounds of a piano played slowly and imperfectly, and a door opening in the late afternoon. And a voice in the kitchen asking whether I want dinner or whether I've already eaten, not because she doesn't know the answer, but because she likes to ask. The answer is always the same. I always want dinner. I am always glad she asked.